I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writers' House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of contemporary poetry and poetics to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope game for poems that interest us, some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Today, I'm joined here in Philadelphia at the Kelly Writers' House in the Wexler studio by Lily Applebaum, curator of the Brodsky Gallery, creator of many symposia here at the Kelly Writers' House, including opening events commenting on the gallery's shows, among them Philadelphia Future Perfect, the intro to which I recommend and is available on YouTube, whose poems have appeared in Apiary and elsewhere, who merges interests in poetry and poetics, environmental science, and social media, who tweets fascinatingly at CitrusAid, and who has helped co-convene a wide-open online course on modern and contemporary poetry called ModPo for the past 3 years, and is a longtime member of the Writers' House community. And by Cecilia Corrigan, a writer and performer and sometimes stand-up comedian based in New York, someone who spent many years here in Philadelphia, including a stint of 4 fabulously generative years, spending a lot of time in this very cottage, whose debut book, Titanic, published by Northwestern in 2014, has already made a titanic impact with positive reviews everywhere and a spot among FlavorWire's top 10 poetry books of the year, who worked on the HBO series Luck with David Milch and has recently finished her first screenplay. And by Michelle Taransky, teacher, poet, poetry series convener, aesthetic enthusiast, whose 2008 collection Barn Burned Then won the Omnidawn Poetry Prize that year, who teaches critical writing and creative writing here at Penn, is a dear, dear friend of the Kelly Writers' House, the reviews editor at Jacket 2 magazine, and whose poems in her 2013 book Sorry Was in the Woods are said by Susan Howe to be, quote, propelled by an urgent and luminescent perseverance in the face of finding one's way step by step in these dark times. Well, today we four have gathered here to talk about 2 poems by Emily Dickinson. The poem given the number 269, famously known as Wild Nights, Wild Nights, and the one numbered 732, less well known, which goes by most of its first line, she rose to his requirement, but it should be she rose to his requirement dropped. Why don't we start with Wild Nights, Wild Nights. The speaker is gendered how? Lily, what's your suggestion on this?
I think it's like, it seems because Dickinson doesn't, in others of her poems, shy away from using gendered pronouns. And sometimes she uses one that's unexpected, like she'll gender an animal or something, even though it obviously doesn't need a gender. So it seems like we could take it to be like intentionally engineered to not have that, so that it might be a gender-less speaker or a speaker that doesn't use gender as part of its identity.
Michelle, the sexuality in the poem could also help us figure out the gendering. Do you want to get into that? I mean, clearly that's what's happening here, right? This is famously a poem about sexual excitement and desire and activity, I guess.
I don't know if that helps us with the gender, because we could assume that it was a wild night of 2 and not know the gender of either. So like Lily was saying, we don't have a gendered pronoun or a gendered object, but we have a union, a thee, an our.
So there's an I and a you.
Yeah.
And who might the you be? I is hard enough, Cecilia, but who might the you? What are some nominations for the you?
I might have an idea about the kind of sex going on because the last 2 lines.
That's crucial, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm kind of leaning more towards a masculine gendered speaker at that point.
I suppose we should somewhat spell that out. How is the engineering of the sex working out there?
More in the is pretty sexy.
More in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can we say what more is, Lily, Cecilia?
Well, you moor a ship if you come into a port or like a place that you want the boat to stop moving, because if you don't tie it down, it will just be carried by whatever current or wind happens.
So you either moor astride a dock or you moor in
Right.
three-sided
Yeah.
dock.
Or you could drop an anchor, I guess, and that would moor
And
the
that would
ship.
count as mooring, I suppose. So what kind? She's rowing. She's not steering a 400-foot yacht. She's rowing. Rowing suggests a certain kind of vessel. And if the vessel is gendered female and the mooring is gendered male, there may be both genderings going on at once.
So we're assuming that one person is the rower and the other is
No,
the
I don't think we
boat.
should assume anything, right?
Yeah.
Is this poem that complicated?
I think it's only complicated because we want it to be, and we're enjoying being uncomfortable in a poem about sex or erotic that we don't know who he or she, that maybe to this group is an exciting thing not to know, especially in a poem that alludes to Eden, which is a biblical story with one of each gender.
Wow. So a sexual romping full of pleasure is characterized by Edenic rowing. What are we saying about it?
I think the line rowing in Eden is interesting because I think when you try to think of the sort of pleasure of the Garden of Eden, you don't necessarily think of doing all that much.
You could say that Eden is kind of standing in for organized Christianity, which has removed her. That's the difficult space in which she's struggling because she's not, as we know, a strict believer.
But we have a suppositional logic here. Wild nights, were I with thee. And it may be that the whole poem is a speculation on what might happen. Michelle, what are we going to do with this were I with thee and presumably the rest of the poem, which is typical of Dickinson and also of Wallace Stevens and a lot of other poets? You realize in the end that this was all just something that might have happened or might happen.
I think there might be a formal clue that goes with that as well, which the first and the last stanza have that rhyme, the luxury, be, see, and thee, and the middle stanza doesn't. So, I mean, it has the off rhyme or the I rhyme, but that she might be showing us that complication, that this is not as easy as we thought. It's not an I and a you or a thou. And I think like Lily was saying about the work, if you're in Eden, if you're a believer, if you're into the organization of religion and rhyming poetry, you wouldn't have to do the work when you're in Eden. Like there's some sort of fall that's happened, like Cecilia was mentioning, so that she has to do this rowing work and she has to like look at a compass and look at a chart. It should be easy when you're in Eden.
But she needs a guide. She needs someone to tell her how to have a wild night.
Oh, so tell her how to have a wild night, not how to like adhere to the organization.
Yeah, it goes either way. Lily, I know you're thinking of something.
And the second stanza, she is already in port because, like, compasses and charts, that's what they're designed to do. They're tools that are made to get you to a safe harbor because, like, why, if you were a sailor, would you want to be stuck in the middle of the wild, raging sea?
Let's ask, though, why would Emily Dickinson, as a metaphorical sailor, ever want to be out at sea and not finding her way back? Go ahead. I mean, we have to say this, don't we?
Well, yeah, because, I mean, her whole life was like she's surrounded by just like a world that is so prim and proper and so decorous, and she doesn't care to be the person in port. She wants to, like, within the power of her mind, like, go explore crazy intellectual puzzles and think about really complicated topics that are usually in the world of ports and like proper behavior only for men to think about.
So the wild night, I mean, I think we have to go back to the last stanza to understand the difference of the desire here. Cecilia is saying, the sea, that's the most ecstatic line. Mm-hmm. So she's rowing in Eden, she's way out there. And thee has as its antecedent possibly the original thee, the very first thee. So presumably a person who is wanted, or more than one person. The second antecedent might, in fact, be the sea. And it's possible that the mooring is actually happening out there in the middle of nowhere. The sea, I want to moor in thee. So it's not mooring at all. Mm-hmm. She's like doing, in a way, the opposite of mooring. Cecilia, go anywhere with any of that. Do you get from this poem this desire to be unmoored, actually?
She's restraining herself even as she's experiencing the desire. Like there's a lot of roping in and reeling in and restraint in this in this sexy poem. And I think that, even like the structure and the way that, the address, the central address, doesn't even come until the very last line, is a way of sort of self-defeating that desire to escape or to, vanish. It could also
Are you
be...
saying that the constraint of the poem itself is a check against the open-endedness of the desire? And if so, why constrain herself that way? I guess this is for everybody, but, Michelle, what do you're constantly teaching this to your students, like you have this constrained form, but this uncontrolled content. Is there a form content irony?
Well, there might be, so that if you are a heart in port, you're a heart that doesn't need a compass or a chart because you're constrained, you're anchored to this place. And the heart seems to be the thing that she would want to identify with. She wants to be a feeling being. She wants to have these wild nights. But if you're at port, it's not going to be wild. You're not going to be rowing or mooring. You're going to be sort of anchored. The question is, do you want to be anchored or do you want to moor?
Let's look at the poem 732. She rose to his requirement. Let's say in a very simple introductory way what this poem is about. Lily, what's it about?
Just what the poem's about is really in the first stanza. So it's about a younger woman who gets married and what happens to her or how her life changes once she becomes married, as opposed to how it was when she was single or a girl.
Does the speaker seem to be the person who gets married? No, right? Okay. Does the speaker have an attitude, Cecilia, toward the person who got married?
A little bit.
What attitude would that be?
A little bit snide, I would say. But it's such an interesting poem because it seems like Dickinson might have actually been telling herself she was writing like an earnest evaluation of the situation, but the scorn kind of comes through.
It comes through. Can we say, any of us, what are some moments where the scorn comes through? I'll start with the diction of the choice of word playthings. Michelle, any other sign of tone?
There's something about to take the honorable work of woman and of wife.
That might be ironic, right? Could be.
I mean, if it's not, it's very kind and earnest and reverent to what her friends have done. Very anti-Niedecker. Like this is your work, like being a wife.
This is so Niedeckerian.
Yeah.
The sense of work in Niedecker is the work I'm doing is actually what you're reading now. And if the speaker, Dickinson, is saying in a story about this friend of hers or someone she knows who's getting married, that's honorable work, but this is honorable work, and it's self-sufficient here. So very Niedeckerian. That second stanza is an if clause. The whole thing is an if clause. Who wants to untangle that and do the sin of paraphrasing it? Lily, start us off.
Okay, well, first of all, what's really, really hard about this poem and that if clause is that the first stanza is so regular. It's like super regular for a Dickinson poem to be the A, B, C, B rhyme structure.
It's A, B, C, B, and the sound, she rose to his requirement, dropped the playthings of her life, to take the honorable work of woman and of wife. So it's 4-3-3-3 in beats, right. I think. Go ahead.
But then the second stanza uses like two different idioms that I'm pretty sure don't really exist in English, which is if aught she missed of amplitude, awe, first perspective, gold. So if aught she missed of, so if aught doesn't make sense to me. Maybe it's just like an idiom I'm not aware of, and also missed of. You would think, I think it's trying to say if she lacked or if she didn't have enough of amplitude, awe, first perspective.
Wow.
But maybe I read it differently.
No.
Oh, okay.
This is great. Can we come back to the disjunction and non-idiomatic writing here and come back to it. Let's come back to it. But let's start with a plain paraphrase. I'll try the first part of it, and maybe Michelle and Cecilia, you continue it. And I'm reading into this, so tell me if I'm wrong. If she perhaps should not actually go ahead and do this, if she should not have shown up at the altar, go ahead. What happens next?
I feel like the first line could also be read as if there was something, if she was like using the language loosely, if there will be something that she will miss in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Because she's done this, because she's
Okay.
said, I'm getting married.
Mm-hmm. What's she going to miss?
She's going to miss awe. She's going to miss amplitude. She's going to miss perspective. I mean,
Prospective,
See, I read it as like
right?
oh, not perspective.
I read it as if she didn't have these things, if she didn't actually have enough of these qualities as judged by his requirement when she did get married. Like if his requirement was that she should have had a little bit more amplitude or a little bit more awe.
It's possible that the key, or one of the keys here, is the it in the phrase, it lay unmentioned, and I'd like for us to spend a minute trying to figure out what would be unmentioned. Is it that if she didn't get married, if she misses something by getting married, and that is amplitude and awe, that's something that's never going to get talked about. How am I doing with that so far? Yes?
Yeah, but I still think the woman the speaker's talking about has gotten married by the end of the poem. Like I think she...
And the speaker, the Dickinsonian speaker, is speculating as to what would be missed, period, what would be missed in that gesture, in that act. So then we have as the sea, and I take that to be a huge conceit hinge, classic Dickinson, that this whole situation, that it not be mentioned, is like, and what is the simile, as the sea developed pearl and weed.
You can't just look at the surface of the sea and know where either pearls or weeds are.
And presumably pearls are happy, good, beautiful, and weeds are ugly, awful. So there's this, sea produces both. Mm-hmm. So this unmentioning, this, I would say, repressing or unsaying is like the sea doing what? Can you abstract?
It's the sea being full of amplitude and awe. But if you don't look closely, it's just the sea. It's just marriage, or it's just the opportunity to not get married.
Cecilia, what is the sea doing that is like the not mentioning of the awe you've given up by getting married? It's so complicated.
Well, it's quite, to me, this stanza is quite self-reflexive, if I can get a little bit biographical, because in a way, the situation she's envisioning between a husband and his wife is the situation Dickinson experiences between herself and the general world that is not interior and private. And I also think, so in a way, the sea might be her own consciousness. It's just about what's unseen and what's non-explicit and what doesn't have a way of being integrated into the public eye.